Good evening. My name is Sam Robinson, Joe Sam Robinson. I have with us tonight Dr. Dennis Ashley. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson.
Dennis is a man of many attributes, but one of them of consequence is that he is the chairman of the Georgia Trauma Commission. And possibly we can talk about that tonight, Dennis. And you've had that position for a number of years, have you not? How long have you been chairman?
Well, I was one of the founding members, actually, along with you
Yes,
back in
many years ago.
2008. We were both founding members together, right. And I'm still there as the chair.
That's quite an honor, quite a responsibility. Well, why don't you describe exactly what the Trauma Commission does? What does it do?
So the Trauma Commission was formed through Senate Bill 60. And at that time, if you remember, I know you do, we were having a lot of issues in the state with trauma care, a lot of chaos, not enough trauma centers, really no system at all. And a lot of legislators got together and said, we need to form some kind of commission to study this problem and to actually put together a network. And through that came Senate Bill 60, which passed and allowed you and I to both be on the Trauma Commission as founding members. 5 members were appointed by the governor. At that time, it was Sonny Perdue.
Yes.
2 members were appointed by the speaker, and 2 members appointed by the lieutenant governor.
Yes.
A 9-member commission.
Yes.
And the overriding authority or responsibility was to develop a state trauma system, oversee fund distribution that comes from the legislators that go to trauma.
Yes.
And to really work on that development. And so over the last 15 years or so, that's been the focus of the commission as we've started to peel back that layer, that onion, if you will, the different layers, and find out what we can do to make the system better.
Now, the issue is, just for the viewers that might have an interest in this, so if you're in South Georgia or anywhere and you're in a car accident, then the system needs to exist to get you where you need to be. And that so-called golden hour makes a big difference. So if we can have a system in the state of Georgia that discovers these trauma victims and gets them where to be for appropriate treatment, that's a huge step forward. And how are things doing with that? Maybe you could say what kind of things have happened. Many injuries take place across the state, and getting them where they need to be is a big task. And how is the Trauma Commission doing?
Well, when we started, there were only about 15 trauma centers throughout the state. You know, Georgia's a huge geographic state.
Yes, it is.
And growing in populace as well.
Yes.
So only 15 trauma centers throughout. And now that number has over doubled to 35 trauma centers, and that includes level 1s, which provide the most comprehensive care, to level 4s, which really sort of stabilize and identify injuries quickly and then transfer to a higher level of care. It includes our burn centers, it includes our pediatric trauma centers. So we've really increased access, if you will, to the number of centers. In addition to that, we've also increased access to people getting to trauma centers. When you were on the commission and first started, we only about 66% of critically injured patients actually were treated at a designated trauma center. Only 66%, 2/3, really got to the level of care that they needed. And now I'm happy to say that that number's creeped up over or around 90%. In some populations, breaking it down by age, it's even higher than that. So access to care, number of trauma centers have increased through educations like this show, where we can get the word out to the public of what a trauma center is and what kind of care that you need to receive. We've been able to improve access to care. And this includes rural Georgia as well as metropolitan Atlanta.
So everyone's nightmare, I think, as a physician or a trauma surgeon, shall we say, is a patient that has a substantial set of injuries and doesn't get where the patient needs to go to manage all these complicated problems, and lingers in an inappropriate location and then expires for that reason. So if we can save lives and we get people where they need to go. And you mentioned how large the state was in regards to population and geographical extent. the legislature has stepped up, and let's give them some praise, to fund the Trauma Commission, to help it in all ways, every way it can. And so how much money does the state give the Trauma Commission? And I know your hand is out, Dennis, to extract some shekels from the politicians and make things work. So how is that? What's the process by which that happens?
So the trauma system in Georgia is funded. Remember when the commission was formed, we had no funds. We had no sustainable funding. We didn't even have a line item in the state budget. So it was a really, I won't say a lame duck, but a non-funded commission.
Yes.
But then when we received sustainable funding through the super speeder law, which means that if you're going over 75 on a 2-lane road or on over 85 on any road in Georgia, you will be tagged as what's called a super speeder. So in addition to your speeding fine, you will get a bill for an additional $200 for that, speeding ticket. And that will go specifically to the Trauma Commission to fund the trauma system. And there's some miscellaneous funds in there too, like driver license reinstatement fees and some things like that. That generates about $23 million a year that can be used for the trauma system. Within the last 5 years, when the fireworks became, the bill passed in Georgia that allowed fireworks to be sold, there's a tax on those fireworks, and 55% of that goes to the Trauma Commission. That's another about $1.5 million or so a year that goes to the commission. And then, so you put all that together, we're running about $24 million a year. Last year, we requested additional funds out of the state legislature, and they gave us an additional $4 million to really what we call the Stabilization Act, which I'll get into in just a moment, what that's for. And right now, that's back in the budget again this year, at least at this point. I haven't seen the final budget yet. So if that stays in, that would push us up to about $29 million a year. Now, you might say, is that enough? And the answer is no, but it's a good start. And the reason I say that is because when we've done assessments, Georgia's led the way nationally of assessing readiness cost. How much does it cost to be a trauma center? How much does this trauma care cost? We've published that data and have actually become the national leader, Georgia has, on that information. And the last survey that we did on 2016 data showed that the cost for a level 1 trauma center, this is not, trauma centers do generate funds as well, but if we exclude all those, the cost for a level 1 trauma center to be ready, to have all the things that you must have before you see the first patient is $10 million.
Right.
A level 2 is 1.8, a level 2 is $5 million.
Right.
A level 3 is 1.8 million, and a level 4 is about 81 to 90,000.
Yes.
So when you add all that up for Georgia, our readiness costs, this is not uncompensated care, this is cost to be ready, it's $120 million a year.
Yes.
So what we've asked the legislature for is about $60 million, about half that.
Yes.
Sort of a partnership, if you will, between government and the private sector to cover the cost of trauma care in Georgia. So we really need another sustainable funding source like the super speeder along, somewhere along that we can count on coming in each year, somewhere around the $60 million level.
Yes. Well, now maybe it would be probably interesting to show the audience pictures of trauma victims, but it's really a pretty horrific picture often. So just imagining the type of patient that is routinely seen at a tertiary care center. It might be, we could think about a patient, maybe a young person in a car accident, and we could go through the litany of injuries that type of person would have and how we would correct them. I mean, some broken bones, maybe we could just go through that with the different kinds of compromised systems, and then how important it is to have tertiary care to look after these patients. If they did not have that level of care, it would be difficult often to live through it. Can you just go through a typical kind of, the ear is macerated, the eyes are, one eye is out. I mean, just Can you-
Sure, that's a great question to help the audience really understand what we mean by trauma.
Yes.
It's major trauma are the injuries that come in, and maybe someone's in a car crash. You know,
Yes.
we see on TV all the gunshot wounds and the catastrophic,
Yes,
on
right.
all these TV shows and things, and
Yes.
certainly that happens.
Right.
But most of our trauma is the average person out there driving to work, maybe going to work during the morning, and they tell their loved one goodbye.
Right.
I'm going to work. I'll see you tonight. I'm going to the child's
Right,
soccer
right,
game.
right.
And the next thing you know, there's a car crash.
Yes.
And they are in the trauma center.
Yes.
And maybe they have a bad brain injury, which obviously you
Yes.
would be involved with. Maybe a brain bleed that needs immediate surgery.
Right, yes.
They may have broken ribs, crushed chest that would involve my service. They may have, you mentioned the ear. Maybe their ear's partially amputated, terrible,
Right.
or facial fractures.
Very
or
common to have
lacerations.
terrific
Very-
facial fractures.
Yeah, very common. Needs a plastic surgeon.
Yes.
And then maybe your leg is broken and you need a rod in your leg for your femur fracture. So
Yes.
now we've got orthopedics involved. So you can see very quickly at when they come in, my team, the trauma team, is at the bedside, meet them, very
Right.
quickly diagnose the problems, and then call in experts like you, our consultants, to
Right.
take on a specific task. And so it's not uncommon that my team may have 3 or 4 different type surgeons on that one patient.
Yes.
That's a lot of firepower that you have to have ready to go 24/7.
That's
you
right.
You can't just say, well, the neurosurgeon will be here Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock,
No,
or the
it's-
MRI scanner. They have to be ready to go at 2 in the morning, Saturday night, Sunday morning. It doesn't matter. That's why it's so expensive. And so that leads into the next question. What's the difference between a trauma center and an ER? The average person out there, if you were to ask, and I know because I ask a lot of them,
Yes.
if you were asked them, do you live near a trauma center? Oh, sure, I live next to an urgent care or an ER down the street.
Right, right.
Well, that may have a doctor that can treat certain injuries, or maybe have certain
Yes.
minor injuries, even an ER that could
Right.
do some fancy techniques,
Right.
but they're not a trauma center if they're not designated and have
Yes.
all these resources ready to go 24/7. And that's the difference between an ER and a trauma center. I sort of like to, people watch NASCAR here in the South.
Yes,
It's big
right.
in Georgia. We love NASCAR, right?
Right.
So when you watch the NASCAR crew, as the car comes in the pit road, they're there. They get their oil, not the oil change. They get their tires changed,
Right,
windshield
right,
clean,
right.
gas, new tires changed. All
Right,
this happens
right.
in like 15 seconds
Right,
because
right.
everybody has a job. That's the trauma team. That's the trauma service. We're ready to go. And when the patient comes in, we all have a job to do, and we do it very quickly. That's the difference between a trauma center and an ER. And obviously, that's the difference between an average garage and a NASCAR team. The NASCAR team is going to be more expensive. The trauma team is going to be more expensive because we have to have these resources ready to go 24/7.
And everyone wants those resources, in my opinion, available for their family. You want that. Who knows when you're going to be afflicted with some unknowable injury. So you're hit by a car, you're on a bicycle, someone hits the bicycle, you fall down the stairs, 911 is called, they rush you into an appropriate location, and sometimes people are flown around the state. I mean, occasionally it's necessary to go to a specialized place, sometimes for vascular problems, sometimes for burns. And so the system exists to get people quickly wherever they need to go in the state, and then it ensures the system is there to have the intensity of care that's needed. So you could imagine a situation where a young person is in some smash-up, comes in to the ER, and sundry tubes are there. The patient is pounced upon by 4 or 5 physicians. Everyone is checking one thing, checking this, checking that, and a huge amount of information is harvested immediately. And so decisions have to be made right there at bedside. What is the best thing to do? So there's a lot of complexity about putting an appropriate care arrangement there. And it's common to get the patient into the OR very quickly. The team has to be there around the clock to do whatever they need to do. So somebody's in a big smash up with all kinds of injuries, and they arrive at the trauma center and a intensive care kind of arrangement, and they get all kinds of things done quickly. A lot of different things are happening. So just going back and forth in the middle of the night to stabilize the patient. And then after the acute phase is finished, the patient would then go to an intensive care unit environment. And why don't you discuss that a little bit as to how that works out after the initial injury, the importance of having intensive care available with all kinds of extensive resources to pull the patient through this dangerous time.
Sure. So initially when the patients come in, we want to quickly diagnose problems. We want to resuscitate the patient. And for the viewers, that means basically give them blood that they've lost, replace their blood volume, or give them IV fluids if they need that, and get their blood pressure up, get their heart rate down. We want to stabilize that patient physiologically. And then if they're bleeding, we want to stop the bleeding, so we would take them to surgery and work on that. So now we're past surgery, or we're out of the OR. We need to go to a place that's safe, a lot of monitoring equipment, 24/7 high-level nursing care and physician care, because those patients are sick. So the initial foray, if you will, into the OR, the ER, the OR, that's just the start. Now we have to really work on that patient, and what we do in the ICU can make a huge difference 6 months down the road. You know, neurologically,
Yes, of course.
how we manage that brain in the ICU
Right, yes.
makes a huge difference 6 months down the road. What's their recovery neurologically?
Yes.
You know, whether it's the spinal cord or whether it's the brain, it can make a big difference. So we have to be vigilant in the ICU, and this is tough times for families because they see their loved one in the ICU, and we allow families to stay in the ICU. You know, one visitor,
Right,
a
right.
wife or a husband or whatever, or family member to stay with the patient. They may be on a ventilator. They may be in a coma.
Yes.
They may be in an induced coma where we've
Yeah.
got them sedated heavily
Right.
while they heal.
Right.
And this is difficult for families. So we're not only managing the patient, but we have to manage the families as well. It's like, you know, what you're seeing is normal,
Yes,
or
right.
it's abnormal, or we're concerned today, or we need to do another test, or maybe we need to go back to the
Yes.
operating room. So we have to be able to move from the ICU very quickly back to the OR if they have a problem. So the ICU becomes a very sophisticated area, and we try to make it as humanistic as we can, but it's not. It's sterile. You know, it's what I mean by sterile. It's you know, it's not your home environment. You know, a lot of machines, a lot
Yes.
of tubes, a lot of beepers and noise.
Yes.
You know, beeps going off. So anyway, but it's a very needed, it's a very safe place for our patients, that they need to be really a cocoon, if you will, that we can monitor them and we can take care of them until we know that they're safe enough, they're going to make it, they can go to the floor. And then that starts a whole nother process of getting them ready,
Yes,
maybe
right,
for the
right.
really sick ones for rehabilitation,
Right,
you know,
yes.
physical therapy. That's where all that starts.
So, you know, I think it's for the lay population, understanding this is often difficult, but it's really a tremendous advantage to live in Georgia with this trauma arrangement present. And other states are behind us about the job that we do. And a lot of this has a financial overhang attached to it. I think we're discovering what can the nation afford, what can it not afford. And I think this is, anyone that's participated in this arrangement thinks this is really good use of resources. Now, one other thing that I think you've looked into a little bit is the investment part of the Trauma Commission. So when money is spent to help patients get back into their life situation without any lasting deficit, that's really a good thing, and it has a substantial economic advantage. And I think we've looked into that a little bit in Georgia, and a lot of money is actually, it's an investment in treating trauma. If we can do a good job, people will get back to work, they'll join their family, they'll do this and that, they'll become taxpayers, you name it. If we can't do that, and the patient is in a nursing home environment or just doesn't make it, that has a very negative impact economically, besides ethically and emotionally. It's a really difficult situation. And maybe one of the big things to say is that investment in trauma is an investment. It's not an expense per se. So people say, well, the taxpayers gave the Trauma Commission $50 million, shall we say. And what did they get for it? We can't spend $50 million every year, but the economic benefit that comes from better trauma care means the state's coffers fill up with the wages that the saved people earn and then pay taxes on it. And so actually it turns out to be a good investment to have a robust trauma system present. Can you speak to that a bit more?
Well, sure. I may kick that back to you a little bit to give some of the history, because you actually sort of invented this methodology that we use to do this. Back when the commission first started, you had presented a paper on, what's the economic impact to the state if we could decrease the mortality rate. You were just doing theoretical gyrations, if you will,
right,
on our calculations on
right.
what if.
Right.
And it was pretty staggering, way up in the millions of
right.
what each person would save if they could get back to work, and the tax implications.
Yes.
And so then fast forward now to just about a year ago, I asked you to come back, now that we've decreased the death rate in Georgia. When we first started, the death rate in Georgia, according to CDC data, this is not any kind of secret information. This is on the website at the CDC.
Yes.
You can look at trauma, you can look at Georgia, and you can see in about 2003 to 2006, we were about 16% above the national average. Worse than the national average for mortality.
Yes.
And with all the hard work that many individuals have done in the state, we have bent that curve down to now, I think it was 22 or 23, somewhere along in there. We're down to 6% better than the national average, or below the national average.
Yes.
So that's over a 20% change, if you will, in mortality. That's a positive. So I ask you to look at, now that we have some data, we know what would that look like. So you might want to comment on what that looks like for the individuals, and well as tax revenue when these people get back to work, because the best thing is to save a life and get a person back to their family. And that's what we all strive to do. But we do know that everything in healthcare has a cost to it. And if we put money in one bucket, we might hurt somebody in another bucket with their healthcare. There's only so much money, so we need to make sure we're trying to help the most people we can. So maybe you could make a comment on, it is an investment for trauma when we do invest in saving lives.
Well, let me just, I'll just talk about it a little bit. So we have an extraordinary amount of money in the United States that goes into healthcare. Maybe $4 trillion a year, a huge amount. In Georgia, about $125 billion a year is here. I use the word sloshing around. All kinds of reasons and things what the money is used for. And the problem is that our outcome analysis and investment returns on the $125 billion are not clearly understood or known. And the tip of the iceberg is just looking at the advantages of good trauma system, economic advantages. So right now, the country is going through a major reassessment of all the money expenses that are out there. And there's a lot of efforts, I would say, to cut back on healthcare expenses. And it's reasonable to try and get the best bang for the buck for your dollar. Nobody objects to that. And there are many ways this could be improved. But one card in the deck that needs to be considered by policymakers is that healthcare is an investment arrangement. It's not merely an expense, there's an investment attached to it. And the investment return would be keeping people in their work arrangement. Also, the psychological impact of sickness on families, that causes another level of difficulty. And finally, one other thing, which is not commonly having much of a discussion, is the multiplier effect of these positive things that happen. So if we add a dollar, if healthcare will produce a dollar's return, we have a person that's working back at work, the dollar that patient earns, it circulates and it causes, it's called in economic circumstances, a multiplier effect, meaning you get extra money for it. So that is a big deal in trying to understand healthcare, is what the economic advantages of good care would be, and they're substantial. And so when policymakers look at this, I think the investment part of it is not really known or discussed particularly. I haven't really seen too much discussion at all. When healthcare is mentioned, it's an expense, and it's more than that. And looking at what happens in Georgia with the Trauma Commission as an example, this would be the money that the state invested in, pick your year, would be the equivalent of buying NVIDIA stock. If you know about NVIDIA, some really high-flying stock that's people lust for. They want this stock. Boy, if I only invested in NVIDIA, or there are a number of others, I could have $1 zillion. Well, the state has done that with its de minimis advances or money put into the Trauma Commission. So the return on the investment has been astronomically good, and the policymakers that did this deserve some credit. And when they consider investments, they need to say, well, I'm really like a stock market investor. I'm going to use the public's money to do things. And there's going to be a return on the money that's spent. It's not just thrown in the trash can. And so this is one of the positive things that's happened with the Trauma Commission money. And so even if only 5% of if you've diminished the number, just to, well, the real advantages, I'll pick a number, is, I don't know, $100 million in return, a huge amount of return. Even if you said, well, 5% is referable to the Trauma Commission, it is still an extraordinary good investment. So when the custodians of the state's money, the taxpayer money, when they do something that's good or bad, the public should know about it. And when they invest in the Trauma Commission, and there are other investments that likewise are good, the public needs to understand this was a really good investment. It's not necessarily an expense. Now, some things you might say are expenses. I don't know what they might be, but a lot of money is tossed aside. And the public doesn't understand where a lot of money goes. But if they understand the economic benefits that the state receives from the Trauma Commission, that could be a pathway to understand other investments the state makes. So you could say, for instance, well, if we put a new highway in, it's going to be a large economic return. Well, this is like a new highway. It's a large economic return plus all of the emotional advantages that people want for the citizens of the state. Nobody wants a sick child to not make it, or injured person not to make it. And when these events happen, it's really quite tragic. You mentioned the family circumstances. In my career, I've seen this a lot, so have you. Suddenly, the family is summoned to the emergency room, and they arrive, and there's suddenly, out of the blue, a loved one is struck down, and can that loved one be saved? And everybody wants a system where the state of Georgia says we're going to make a huge effort to do that. And I think the largesse of the state legislature, I'll give them praise for this, and I hope it will continue. What do things look like in the present legislative session? How does it look to get some money for the Trauma Commission? What's happening?
Well, I think, the governor came out with the budget, the initial budget, with our $4 million
yes.
left in it from last year. So we're hoping that will stay in there. And certainly that would be a good start. So I'm hopeful.
All right. Well, Dennis, thank you so much for being here, and keep up the good work. You've I think you're going to get a reward, at least in the next world, for your efforts on this 20 years just about of shepherding this process through. So thank you for being here and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.